My dear friends, how lovely to see you all again and to have you completing this pre-Lenten journey with me. Just as an aside, I'm doing a Zoom Lenten study based on my Lenten studies Going Deeper with Jesus. I do have some free copies to give away, and if anyone is interested, please DM me and I will get one to you. If you also wish to join me in the Zoom, please DM me your email address and I'll get the link to you. The study is based on the Gospel of Luke, and we will be looking at the Gospel passages for each week of Lent. And I do hope you will join us. So for today's readings, we're looking at the concluding passages of the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. Now, I confess a bit of frustration with our lectionary reading, for in concluding the sermon, we're only really looking at the first part of the conclusion. The passage concludes with the parable of building on sand and rock. This is an important conclusion to the whole sermon. What Jesus is in effect saying is this: you think by following your traditions and the way you think about your relationship with God, you are building your house that is built on a rock. And this is a reference to the temple, which was built on the rock. And it goes to the trust that they had in their relationship with God because they had the temple. Today, where the Muslim Dome of the Rock is built, is where the temple stood. Jesus is saying, you think you've built on rock, but in reality, you've built on sand. Building on sand results in the fall of the house when the storms come. And this is what happens in AD 70 when the Romans destroy the temple. The only truly way to build on the rock is to build on the words of Jesus and to follow his teaching. Anything else results in failure. So this is the culmination of the teaching that we read in today's gospel. It's quite short, so let's listen to it. Jesus told his disciples a parable. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into the pit? No disciple is superior to the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like their teacher. Why do you notice the splinter in your sister's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own? How can you say to your sister, "Sister, let me remove that splinter in your eye," when you do not even notice the wooden beam that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, remove the wooden beam from your eye first, then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your sister's eye. A good tree does not bear rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For people do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor do they gather grapes from brambles. A good person out of the store of goodness in their heart produces good, but an evil person out of a store of evil produces evil. From the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. That's really deep, isn't it? Last week, we discovered that Jesus calls us to extravagant love. Here, then, is Jesus calling us to be righteous, to be fruitful, and to build wisely. Jesus does this with 3 proverbs more than parables, even though that's what the text says. That's the translation is that they're parables, but really they're proverbs. To take his words seriously is what he's on about, and to use these words of his as a basis for our own self-examination is the whole point of what Jesus is on about. The first proverb is really a 3-image picture. There is warning that the blind cannot lead blind people. There is recognition that a pupil eventually becomes a teacher, and there is an appeal to proper self-evaluation before evaluating others. In other words, one should choose one's teachers carefully, make sure one is going in the right direction, and not be too quick in setting others straight. The next unit makes the point that what one produces reflects what or who one is spiritually. The point of the proverb is to encourage the examination of the quality of our own spiritual core by looking in detail at what we produce ourselves. I remember when I was a chaplain at St John's Grammar School at Belair here in South Australia. It's when the school was a primary school. We had a senior school chapel for the day, and we had this passage, and I asked for a volunteer to be blindfolded, and then I got one of the students to give guidance to the blind person so they could navigate their way through the chapel. This worked fine when the one giving the guidance was sighted. But when I blindfolded the next person, hilarity and chaos reigned. Don't worry, no children or chaplains were injured or hurt in any way during the experiment. We did have a lot of fun though. And it made the point of the proverb though. If we ourselves are blinded spiritually, how on earth can we give spiritual guidance ourselves? The point Jesus is trying to make is a little bit deeper than simply guiding students through a chapel, though. The point he appears to be making is this: if you try to lead, or if I or you or anyone else tries to lead others on our own, we're in danger. Jesus is warning against self-righteousness. The setting, of course, seems to be that the leaders who are leading the wrong way are the Pharisees. Thus, but for the church, being arrogant and judgmental is something that the church and the disciples must therefore avoid at all costs, because that's how the Pharisees were perceived. Then, to really make the point, Jesus turns to the importance of choosing an instructor, given that the pupil will eventually become the teacher. Thus, if you choose a poor teacher, you'll become a poor teacher. If we choose an arrogant teacher, we'll become an arrogant teacher. If we choose a self-righteous teacher, we will become self-righteous. Darrell Bock puts it this way: it's like this, like parent, like child. And I think that's very true. Jesus rounds out the teaching in righteousness by giving us an image that plays into the sight image in the first proverb. However, in this proverb, Jesus uses a hyperbolic structure that carries the emotive force that we read in the passage. The contrast is simple. Considering a speck like a flake of wood or chaff or straw, and then considering what is in effect the entire builder's beam that supports the construction of a house, is completely and utterly ridiculous. Jesus' point could not be more simple, more damning. What nerve someone with major problems has to be concerned with minor problems of another. Jesus is not saying we should not concern ourselves about minor problems. Rather, he's saying we need to deal with the major issues first, which are usually within us, and then we can easily deal and resolve the minor ones, the minor issues that are in others. And the reason for self-examination and correcting being critical is important. It may seem that the tree bearing fruit, good or bad fruit, it may seem that the tree bearing good or bad fruit, what type of fruit you get from, what sort of tree, and the goodness or otherwise of a person's heart may seem a completely different issue to what Jesus has been on about. But nothing could be further from the truth. The fruit that the teacher produces reflects what is at their core, at their heart, either good or bad. The fruit from the tree cannot be different from the character of the tree. Fruit is the picture of the product of one's life. Some commentators suggest that the fruit is the type of disciple a teacher produces, but I think that's really difficult to sustain. I think this is all about who we are as individuals, who we are as people. And the final section summarizes the truth about what Jesus is saying in the first half. An evil person out of a store of evil produces evil, but a good person out of the store of goodness in their heart produces good. This is advice that we should heed, not just for choosing our teachers, but for choosing the people we associate with, whom we allow in our churches, and more importantly, whom we allow to lead in our churches. Bitter and twisted people will cause others around them to become bitter and twisted, and we do not need those sorts of people in our churches, let alone have them leading us. The sermon has 3 parts then. The declaration of God's promise that those who unite themselves to God, especially the downtrodden, the hungry, etc., will have their situation will be reversed and they will be rewarded. The promise acts as a foundation of hope. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week was the call to extravagant love, even if it means being abused. And it's necessary because this is the true nature of God in Christ Jesus. Jesus who loved to the end, even death on a cross. This love does not seek its own welfare, but the welfare of others. It is exceptional love. This means that we are not to judge, and that's the story of this week. That's the lesson for this week. We are not to judge, but we are to extend mercy and forgiveness, which in turn have their rewards in God's rich blessings and approval. The final Proverbs then describe the importance of whom one follows, as well as how one looks at oneself. Since they will look like their teacher, they will need to be discerning. We will need to be discerning in who they and we choose to follow. And we should be willing to take responsibility for our own affairs and our own faults before seeking to instruct others. What a disciple projects as their character will be an insight into their spiritual life and their true self. Whoa. I don't know about you, but I just sort of feel overwhelmed by all of that. Now, I understand, therefore, why the Sermon on the Plain is talked about, but rarely acted upon, especially the last bit. If we were to take it seriously, then we would seriously seek to look at ourselves honestly, which we simply do not want to do, because we're probably not going to like what we see. And then we would honestly, and then, of course, we'd actually have to honestly see our own faults and failings, and that just might be too much for us. However, the longer we fail to do this, the more we will produce people in our church like us. The longer we will fail to love extravagantly and sacrificially, and therefore the less hope we will transmit to those who are looking for us for that hope. It is my hope that we will seek to embody the Sermon on the Plain in our lives, and especially to embody it in this upcoming season of Lent. That's why I think it's here in the last 3 weeks as we lead into Lent. It's what I'm going to try and do for my Lenten discipline. I'm going to try and seek to uphold all of those aspects of the Sermon on the Plain. I'm not looking forward to it, but I'm also looking forward to it as well, if you know what I mean. And as I do that, I want to see where that takes me. And so my challenge is, what about you? The Lord be with you.